Thermophilic composting. Well, this is really the core of Dr. Ingham's work, is this whole method for composting. From this method is where you get those microorganisms that you need for the soil biology. So we can do some of these practices right on the farm and in the soil directly by mulching and so forth. But in order to actually get this level of turn in there, the turning from whatever that soil is to the new biology that those plants need, and for our moringa, we have to do this composting. Or the vermiculture, we'll talk about that too, to sell, they're very similar. Some places composting is possible to do, and other places it's really not because of the large amount of raw materials. Those raw materials are all things that we have in most places in everyday life. Some places, of course, really difficult terrain and very undeveloped areas wouldn't have things like paper and cardboard in abundance. But there are substitutes for all of those materials. Some places don't have a lot of trees, so there is some limitation to where this can be done, but for the most part, it can be done in many, many places. So this is the process we're going to go through. Know that composting is a lifelong learning. I've learned so much. I continue to learn. And even though you see something in in the PowerPoint in a contained situation, when you're out on the land, it's different. Things aren't exactly, they don't turn out exactly. And so there's an art to it, and there's a perseverance that's needed. Now, I've done so many compost piles, this specifically, over the years, and I've taught it, and I can say that I haven't done one twice, the same way. There's always different materials, there's always variations, and that's important for you to stay flexible and creative. And sometimes when you're monitoring and you don't know what's happening, you have to track through. So I always follow a certain process so that I can duplicate what I've done. And then when I can duplicate it, I can go back and check it more easily. So just if you haven't composted before, just kind of listen through and see if it makes sense about what this is all about. And the thermophilic composting is very specific to Dr. Ingham's work. And it means heat. There's hot compost, and you'll see that in many places. It's just called hot compost. And so this is also called biological composting as well, because it's focusing on biology, and thermophilic because it's heating up. But hot compost is also thermophilic, right? But this is a specific type of hot compost. So how to make the hot compost, and you can see, there's great images with it. It heats up, and the heating is something that has to also be monitored very well during the process, because if it isn't, your pile can go above the 160 degree, that's the high level, and start to become anaerobic, because anaerobic bacteria can live in those temperatures where aerobic bacteria cannot. And you'll be losing nitrogen, that is just be evaporating, just cooking, right? Cooking too hot. So making thermophilic compost is a great way to process large amounts of organic material in a specific way with specific ingredients to create a concentration of microorganisms. In the process, pathogens and weed seeds are destroyed because the temperature of the compost stays at a level that kills them off. So that's important to understand. When you have all the different manures that can be a part of this, there's E. coli and salmonella and pathogens, parasites. We also, if you have horse manure, you're going to have seeds. So if you put plants in there that have gone to seed, all of that you want to cook down, so that high temperature between 131 and 60 is the heat that you need for killing weed seeds and killing pathogens that could be in that compost. These are the types of thermometers, and there's many. There's a variety. They select one that's durable, whatever you can afford, that's as durable as possible. And if you're doing large piles, larger than the cubic yard, you want to have a 4 foot long. They come in 4 foot lengths, and you just want to make sure that you see this upper orange one, these two up on the top, that's a cage. And on the right side there, you can press on that cage. It's designed specifically to take pressure, but these smaller ones, if you push on them, they could break off. So they're in that way a little bit fragile because it's a farm tool, but you want to take care of it. This is a couple of videos I put together, and this is early on. She was doing work with an organization called Farming Secrets in Australia. And so she just gives you, this is just like the little beginning of her explaining backyard compost, like if you're just going to do a cubic yard. And you can watch that on your own. These are the basics behind it. Gather all the materials. Piles will start to decompose. So in this, you'll see that they've gathered over time or even in a day, but it's easier if you can do it over time, as you have leaves and mulch and paper materials, cardboard, all these different materials that you'll see him listing here. And you want to gather them all in that spot. Well, as you have a big pile of something, it can be decomposing. There's microorganisms already in that material, and they are composting. Even though we haven't done anything specific with them yet, they're still in a habitat in some way. Anything that has been like out on the farm. Paper, you're not going to find that, and cardboard. But if you pile up cardboard, you'll find earthworms because they love the glue, the microorganisms that eat that glue. And so you could have to be looking through to take your earthworms out, but if you don't, they'll just, as it heats up, they'll just exit. So that biology is already in the pile that you're bringing. The high nitrogen materials you want to have, legumes, peas, beans, anything high nitrogen, and then you can just go and look. There's lists of things that are high nitrogen. Clover, so nitrogen fixing, clover, vetch, buckwheat, cover crops. Those are all things that are really good for the soil. So you want to have that selection. All different types of manures we're going to go over. Really all manures can be used from animals who eat plants. So no cat or dog manures. People do use pig manure, even though sometimes they give pigs meat product. So if the pigs have been on a vegetarian diet, chicken manure can be used, and I go over it specifically because a lot of farms have chickens, but you cannot just spread chicken manure onto your plants because chickens are omnivores. They eat all kinds of insects and worms, and which those would create a manure like a meat-eating animal. They're also cannibalistic. They eat other, if a chick dies, they'll eat that, or any chicken that's weak, they peck at it and they will eat it. So, but any snakes, it's really good if you have snakes in your area, they'll eat that. So chicken manure, we have to handle really specifically. So when you have the proper percentage of these different materials in that pile, it'll heat up in 24 hours. And the recipe that she always follows is a dominant fungi. So most soils are lacking in fungi, even if it's a plant that has a high bacteria need in the soil. It also needs fungi. And so we always are putting fungi even on high bacteria plants, because that still needs to be in there. You still need the balance of everything in there. So this is where you begin. And you can see, you can create bins like this. We had ones that were made out of cinder block. They were hard sides. And so then you can easily build in one of them and then turn the pile into the other. And then turn, if you have three, we had three in a row, and then you turn it into that third pile, and then you can start a new pile in that first bin, and then just be going back and forth. So there's some timing as you start to do this if you want to have back-to-back compost piles, because it does take time for the process and also for the curing. So there's the universal inputs are carbon, nitrogen, water, and air. The compost is 1 cubic yard. So in that 1 cubic yard, you want that amount of all that weight, that volume. That's what really kicks in that thermophilic activity. And to get to that, even as you're building that, you want it to be 4 or 5 even feet higher than that. Or, I mean, 4 or 5 feet tall, right? Because a lot of that, as you're throwing that on there, is air. And in a short time, that air will compress. So if you start at 3 feet, you're going to end up with like a 2-foot little pile there. You want to keep that volume up. So overfill that your pile so that it'll compress down and you'll have that enough end material. So collect all the materials in advance. Thoroughly water the day before. So once you start to water, now you're really speeding up that process as you're waiting. And that's 24 hours in advance. So all ingredients in it's going to start to work in that pile. You want water, you want a hose source, because you're going to be watering before, during, and after. And you want a cage or a bin of some type. She had those metal cage. That's what we use too. We also have a recycled, like it's recycled tires, I believe. And so some municipalities have those available, but you want something that will hold it together. Some people do an open pile without something to hold it together. But as this is moving, you don't want to like keep losing it out, because that disperses the heat. You want to really hold that together so the heat is also held in. And then a tarp to cover it. So if you're in a rainy area, you want to make sure that it's not running through your pile and just rinsing your nutrients away. It'll be cooling your pile down. So we close that up. And if you have any little creatures around, it helps to keep that out. You might have to do some additional things like put, tanglefoot, it's called, or things that mice or rats can't get up into it. But if it's closed up and it does not have any animal parts in it, then those kinds of animals aren't going to be interested. But sometimes like raccoons are curious and they'll get in there and they'll kind of take it apart. So you really want to wrap that up. We call it putting it to bed, and you want to wrap that up. And then you want your thermometer, because you're going to be using that every day, and maybe even several times in a day. If there's something that, if it gets really hot and you need to keep rechecking it. So that's a really important piece. You have to have a compost thermometer. They come in 2 feet and 4 foot lengths. And then a daily log. So you want to be able to track this as you go. I'll also list the ingredients of every pile. So if there's a pile that is like it heats up right away, it goes 3 days, we turn it on the 4th, it just goes like clockwork. I want to try to reproduce that. So if I list all those materials and a little, kind of as much as you can, as close to the weights of those materials, that way, if you want to duplicate one, you can do that. It's just an important little strategy to have. And it's a big job, so invite friends to help. I've turned compost piles by myself. It's a job, and you can't just do some of it and come back later and do some of it and come back later. You need to do it all at once. So having people come and do it together, that's why it was really good when we had our classes, because the whole class, everybody could take turns. And it was a kind of a running joke with us, because one of the courses we had, there was a man named Dr. Mike Erdman. He's a professor of engineering at Penn State University. And he would say, well, I would say, okay, when I was like practicing with them and say, okay, when's the best time to turn a compost pile? And he would always say, when you have a class. because he could see, the work of it. So you want to have a class, or we also had a compost club. So there were people who would, come to our tours, and they would say, I'd love to be able to learn how to do that and do one together with people, but I live in an apartment or don't have land or something. So I thought, okay, we'll start a club. And we did. We had about 7 or 8 people, one man and the rest women. And some had land enough to do it, but they just thought they'd participate in something that was with other people, doing a compost pile together. And so we would go out, and I would teach everybody how to do the thermophilic compost. And we'd have all those materials, and we'd build that pile together. And I, it was at my place, so I was out there, monitoring, but I would text everybody, this is the temperature today, and today, and today, and okay, it's time to turn it. Whoever could come, because sometimes during the week, would come and we'd turn that compost pile. And then we'd meet, once a week, sometimes, every two weeks, and talk about it. But in 2 weeks, your pile is, close to being done. So it was just a good way to share the information, share the work. And then once it was finished, everybody could come and get as much compost as they wanted. So people who live in apartments or small areas and they can't do a compost pile, they could participate, and then they got some compost for what they're growing. So it was a really good experience. Build by layering. So you can see once you start, and how to start is you soak those materials 24 hours, except paper. So you want shredded paper, and if you have like a shredding machine, that's great, because you can just shred it all and just keep it in really big bags or boxes. But if you do that in advance, it just becomes a big clump, it all just sticks together, and you have this big clumpy stuff, and it's hard. As you turn it, you'll still see some of this clumpy stuff. Grass clippings also, if you're not, really spreading them out thin, they'll just mat down and become, and even at the end, you could still have gone through this whole process, and you'll still have to take out this big, thick, kind of slimy, thick chunk of grass clippings that never got decomposed. So paper you want to just wet as you're putting it in, and not before. So begin layering with the other ingredients. We start with mulch on the bottom, and then all the layers is just alternating all the layers as you go up, watering as you go, again 4 to 5 feet high. And then you take, once you get that height, you take that cage off, and then set it up again right next to that pile. And now you're going to turn that into the pile. So early on, Dr. Ingham had us just build it like that. And then the next day, after it's been there, come back and turn it the first time, And what happens though, when you do that, you have all these layers that are the same thing. Each layer is the same. And so there isn't really a mix there. So then she changed it later on and said, do your layers and then build the pile with those layers. And so as you're building it, you're taking it from the sides and the top, and now you're mixing all of those as you're refilling that cage or that container, that bin. And now you wait the 24 hours or 48 hours. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer. So you turn, so you want to check the moisture level. So it's pretty scientific. You just, because you've been watering, so you just grab a handful of that kind of in the middle if you can, or not on the outside, because big parts would have fallen into the outside. So you want to kind of get inside the pile, grab some, and just squeeze it with your hand. And you squeeze it, if there's a drop, that's good, that's a good amount. And if there's you can just barely see moisture in your fingers there, but if it's dripping, it's too wet. If there's no moisture coming out, you open it your hand and nothing, it just falls apart, it's too dry. So that's why it's an art. You really want to get to where you just barely can squeeze some water, but you open your hand, so that clump stays together. That's about 50% moisture, and that's what you want. So if it's not there, you're going to need to add more water, so add more carbon, because carbon, those paper and cardboards, those kinds of things will absorb that water. So that's why as you do these, you'll get used to like how much water, so you're not drenching it. You should not see water just roll, flowing out from your pile. Wet it good, turn each, even you could like make sure that each layer gets turned a little bit as you're doing it, and water that, but don't drench it. And then you cover the whole thing with a tarp and really button that up good so no little creatures can get in there. It's also creating darkness because fungi likes darkness, and it's creating that heat to just be staying inside there. It also protects if you're in a rainy area. So these are the ingredients, many different kinds of ingredients, but there's two types, carbons and nitrogen. And so carbon is brown, except for coffee grounds, which are brown, but they're actually a green, they're actually a nitrogen. There might be a few other exceptions to that. Also, when you cut something that's green, when you cut it and it turns brown, that's still a green. Those nutrients are still in that material. So these are some examples of carbon, lint from your dryer, any kind of shredded paper, leaves, wood chips, sawdust, any animal bedding, like if you have hamsters or chickens or something, you have sawdust or some kind of bedding. That's a really good thing. Chicken, actually, you'd have to compost that. So these are really clearly brown and carbon, high amount of carbon. And then these are greens. Nitrogen are green, except for coffee. Manures are a nitrogen. So yeah, so here's coffee grounds, garden clippings, feathers, feathers that aren't too big, that quill will take a little breaking down, kitchen scraps, grass clippings, seaweed, tea bags, because tea, and also if you are a tea drinker, you can save all those. It's just like making all these materials that we have in our world every day be available for us to use and turn it into something really nutritious for our plants. So why are carbon to nitrogen ratios important? So the ratio, the amount of carbon to nitrogen in every material has that ratio. And there's lists that you can go, we'll have a list in the resources and the advanced resources, because everything has a ratio. It's already been worked out. I don't know who does it, US Composting Council probably. And so that's what you want to keep in mind when you're putting these materials in, because something that could be carbon and nitrogen neutral even, right? So greens, grass and manure have a higher level of nitrogen, browns like paper, wood chips have a higher level of carbon. And in the process, we're going to go over these terms, you're going to see mesophilic and thermophilic, and that's a part of the process. And that's a part of the heating up process. So mesophilic organisms thrive in moderate temperatures. They break down the organic matter and reproduce, causing heat in your pile. They do best in temperatures from 68 to 113. So as you have built your pile and starting to heat up, you've gone through that mesophilic part where it's going from cold to getting warm and to getting 113, or it can be more, a little bit more. And there's certain organisms that really thrive in those temperatures. And as it gets hotter, then those microorganisms are replaced by thermophilic microorganisms that thrive in high temperatures. So those are aerobic microorganisms. They thrive up to 160 degrees. So then you move into that anaerobic condition. It's still a thermophilic, it's still a heat, but it's now past the point that the aerobic bacteria can live in. So it goes into anaerobic. So that's why the monitoring it is really important, because you can be killing your bacteria and losing nitrogen. It will be evaporating. And also that heat kills pathogens. So E. coli, salmonella, sometimes if you had sitting water, that could have less. Listeria is a waterborne pathogen, parasites, things that come from manures, for example. So seeds, weed seeds, any kind of seeds in there, they get killed off at these high temperatures. And so that's another reason that you want to maintain those temperatures. Materials rapidly break down, speeding up the composting process. So we talked earlier, just the introduction to composting. You can have a static pile, right, that just sits and it just decomposes over time. You can have a working pile. You can have a hot compost. So all of these are varying different ways to do composting, and they all have their own parameters. And this is specific for thermophilic. Thermophilic, it's because of that heat, and you're maintaining it and then turning it so it doesn't continue to get hotter and hotter. You're turning it to keep it at that temperature. Well, that's important because it's speeding up the process too. So here's some of the issues. Too much carbon and the compost process will slow down. Too much nitrogen. Nitrogen will be lost in the form of ammonia, and then you'll also smell it. So if you have too much nitrogen, and it'll start to heat up faster. Nitrogen is more heating than carbon. High nitrogen is actually what's causing a lot of the heat. And if you have too much nitrogen in your pile, you will be able to smell it because it will start to putrefy. So if you've ever had piles of grass clippings and you let them sit for a while and they start to heat up, they also start to smell. So these are things that you want to like start to interact and be knowing what's happening in your compost pile. So these are the carbon to nitrogen ratios of some of them. There's long lists. These are just a few, but you can see this is how it's broken down. These, coffee grounds, vegetable waste, chicken manure, which is a high, and it's considered a green. It's a high nitrogen. I'm going to talk about that specifically. Cow manure, horse manure, sheep manure, pig manure, food waste, and grass clippings. Those are all greens. Browns are straw, bark, hardwood, bark, softwood, corrugated cardboard, sawdust, wood chips, leaves, seaweed, and more. There's just like, and we can, you can look at, but these are the most common. There's lists and lists of everything that's been evaluated. So this is the recipe that we want to follow. We are on the right side here, fungi dominant. And so these are the percentages in order to create that fungi dominant pile. If you have too much of the materials for fungi that's a high carbon, you might end up with a pile that doesn't heat up. So keeping these percentages in balance like this is really important. You could be wanting to make a bacteria dominant pile, not for moringa, but if you were wanting to grow like lemongrass or other kinds of grass, prairie grass, things that certain kinds of weeds that like dandelion and nettles, things that are in that weed category, malva, these are in the weed category, high bacteria soils. Or you might want to grow grass for your animals. Then you want that bacteria dominant pile. So I have both of them there. You can see the fungi dominant is high nitrogen. So those are those high nitrogen are those manures. That's the high nitrogen. Coffee grounds is a high nitrogen. Oh, no, it's just a green. And so then there's the woody matter, green matter, and then woody. And woody is your mulch and your things that come from trees like cardboard and paper. And it's by weight. So you're keeping these, in mind. So also your weight, the weights of these, in case you want to reproduce that pile. Moisture level again, 50%, and I, spell it out, and you get a handful of it. You squeeze it. If a drop comes out, it's good, barely in between your fingers here. If it drops out, it's too wet. If it's just it comes apart. So these are the parts to pay attention to. Fungi inoculated mulch pile. So this is what we do in order to ensure that we have more fungi in those piles that we're making. So it's really important to have one of these. It makes you have more confidence that you're going to have a fungi dominant pile. So even you're putting all of those fungi foods, we have to do that, but this is one really good, sure way. So I have a fungi pile that is, I've gathered up, 2 or 3 feet of mulch into a pile, and I have it underneath one of my moringa trees. And because there's going to be some leaking out that's going to come out, and fungi are going to migrate. So you're actually going to benefit that tree that's right there. So you can see in the pictures, you have fungi inside that pile, and there's a whole colony, and you're creating that habitat. So you're going to have that 2 or 3 foot pile of mulch in the shade. So you don't want this to be, glaring in the sun. It is going to be kept dark and warm. That's the habitat for fungi. And so, this is the technique. You water that fungi pile thoroughly, that mulch pile, and you make sure you're, turning it, make sure all of that is well wet. And then if you have already at the time, or if you don't, it'll come in time, whenever you cut mushrooms up and you have something left over from it, you just put it in there. I dig a hole, bury it in there, make sure that it's wet. When you go on walks and you see the fruiting body or anywhere in your property, you see, especially after a rain, you see any fruiting body coming up. Wild mushrooms, you just dig that out like 6 inches all around, so you're getting that mycelium that's in the soil, and you bury it in there. You go on a walk in the forest and you see fungi, you see mushrooms like this, just, scattered about, just growing. The diversity. You want to get as many different kinds of fungi that way, more so than if you just go to the store. You could also just go to the store and buy, pounds of mushrooms and put those in. It's a little more expensive way to do it, but it's possible to do. And so you want to make sure that you cover that. So I have big pieces of cardboard that I just lay over. When I have cardboard, I wet it and lay it on top of there, and then I cover it with a tarp. So now you have that habitat there that fungi love, and you have a food source. You have all that mulch, and you have food. You can put soil in there, as well. Sometimes I do this with clay because I want to break clay down and make it into good soil, and fungi break down some sand, silt, and clay. So you can also add clay into there if you have clay. So you want to cover that, and then when you're building your pile, you go in there and you dig some of that out, and you'll see there's just like some areas might have more than others. Sometimes if I want to do this quickly, I'll put like oat flour, or bird seed. You really find bird seed. I had a big bag of sesame seed that was really old, and I just put that in there and covered it. In a few days, you could have this product. So you don't have to do it so far in advance. Fungi grow pretty quickly, but you still want that watered and covered with a cardboard and covered with a tarp, and make that habitat. And then it's more on the surface. So when I did that recently, I had it more on the surface of that pile rather than burying it inside. And so that's another way, and there's recipes that people do. They take some forest floor soil and some mulch and some oat flowers, most commonly used, and then you make it a little bit wet and put that in a dark place, and 3 or 4 days you open it, you have fungi. So fungi is a really easy thing to be able to get, and you can do it in many different ways. So this is one that I have an inoculated pile that I keep going all the time, and I just monitor it. And when it rains, I make sure that it's covered really well, because you don't want to, have that drain away. So or get too wet, because then of course anaerobic, right? Even in a fungi pile. So this is a really important piece to add in when we're creating our fungi piles, fungi dominant piles. These are comparisons of different manures, so you can see the moisture levels, and you might have ones that are close to zero because these are moisture level when it's wet. When it's dried out, you're not going to have those levels, but the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And chicken wasn't on there, but now we're going to go over chicken. Chicken manure is a high nitrogen manure. And you can use it, and you must use it with high management and caution. So it has the E. coli and salmonella. More predominant is salmonella, but a lot of different bird animals. If you are having turkey and other, they have the pathogens too. Peafowl, things like that. That could be on a farm. Ducks have a very low heat manure because they are vegetarian, right? Peafowl also, but peacock is, who has peacocks, right? But some people do. We're just at a farm, they have, peacocks, wild peacocks came through. But chicken manure is very specific. It's a very hot manure. You might have a lot of it, but you really want to compost that. Sometimes, like one of the things we have done, because we had about 85 chickens at one point, so we would take that manure when my daughter would muck that whole area out, and would lay it out in the sun, spread it out, so it dried out and it was baked in the sun, and so that it could really get go through that composting. Or you could do a hot compost with it. It's just very hot. It's a whole method of just mixing other soils and things with it to heat it up, and at least 6 months. So we never used it more than 6 months. Now, if I wanted to have enough fresh manure, because I want to use a certain amount of fresh manure because it's going to heat up, but a really small percentage, like less than 10%, I could gather that up as the chickens were, pooping, put it in a closed container, and now that I can use as a fresh, even if it's 6 months old. So that's one way. If you end up with fewer chickens, you can use that. If you have put it in a closed container, it has a very high smell. Chicken manure is pretty intense, right? So yeah, that high temperature that we're going to do, it's going to kill the E. coli and salmonella and other pathogens, parasites. So another reason you don't use fresh manure, chicken manure, is that if you put it on leafy things that you're going to eat, you're going to have that right on there. So never spread fresh chicken manure on anything. You probably put it under trees or something, but not on anything where you're going to eat that food. So never should be fresh, never should be on any fresh food. Should be composted at least 6 months at a high heat. It adds organic matter. It increases water holding capacity. It provides more nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium than horse, cow, or steer manure. So as far as the value of it, it's very, very high value for composting, but just manage it really, really well. This little video, I thought it was really good, and they have a lot of resources. It's in the resource page of the compost pile monitoring. So I'll let you watch that on your own, but I have notes on it here. So getting feedback from your pile. So that's the process for further reduction of pathogens, the PFRP is what they call it. There's 4 methods. You're going to look at temperature, moisture, odor, and observation. It's like really just looking at the pile. So temperature corresponds to the amount of microbial activity. Thermophilic compost is a high temperature compost. 131 to 160 is the required. So this is something that, if we have a US composting council, and every country might have something like that, and they have regulations. If you want to sell compost as a farm amendment, it has to be registered, and so there's a whole process for that. So you can get into large composting, and then that's going to be regulated. And so there's a whole method, and you'll see it's pretty similar to what keeping a log, which is what we'll show. And he shows it in there, the log that's used, so they can see what's happening in your compost over time. And they'll probably send, you have to have a lab test to make sure there's no pathogens in that end product. So it's all some under regulations. So you want to take the core temperature, which is really important. If you have a 2-foot thermometer and you don't put it in all the way to the middle, because you should have like 4 feet, but if you have a 5-foot pile and you put it down the middle, you are not getting to that core. So if your pile is higher at the beginning, you have to dig down in there and put that thermometer so that the tip of that, only the bottom 2 inches are actually the active part. So you want to put that all the way down in there. In the sides, you want to make sure that you're getting into the core of your compost pile. Okay, so the moisture content, we went over, you squeeze that, and he shows it there too. You have a good idea of what we're talking about. The odor, of course, that's anaerobic conditions if you have an odor. It also could be that it has too much moisture and there's a lack of oxygen in there. So it means there could be too compressed, not enough air in there, because we want aerobic bacteria there. So anaerobic can live in very compacted soils, which have a lack of oxygen, right? And that's their habitat. So the structural density, means you can put your thermometer all the way in. There's, it's not obstructed by big clumps of something, or it's not so dense that it doesn't easily go through, because it should be, air in there. So that's another one of just like the structural density. If it slumps and it sags, that's a sign of too much water. And so these are the kinds of information you would have to turn that and, dry that out, put more carbon in there. And these are important things of understanding what's going on. So those observations of seeing what's happening, once you've tested all those things, you want to look at the pile and see how it's doing. And there's something that just comes with experience. If you've had a compost pile that never heated up and it's like, what do I do? Well, you can go get more greens and nitrogens and then redo that pile. That biology that's there with that carbon content is still there. So if throw it all out and it's like, oh, I didn't do it, I couldn't do it. Well, just start over. It all comes with practice and experience. So here's taking the temperature we just mentioned. You can see there's the thermometer. It's down into the top and then along the sides, 2 places along the sides. So every day when you're taking the temperature, you're taking 3 temperatures at least. If you take 3, then you just add them together, divide by 3, and that is the number that you log, not each of the temperatures separately. You're going to take the average temperature every day, and that's your input for that day. So then you are going to have a log eventually that's filled out as the average temperature. So here's the turning of the logging part. And we're going to get further into that. So you're going to take the temperature every day, keep a log. It should get hot after 24 to 48 hours. The first day it reaches temperature is day 1. You maintain that temperature. You're taking that temperature every day from 131 to 155, 3 days in a row. You turn the pile on the 4th day, and you repeat that for 3 days on again, 3 days at temperature, turn on the 4th, and you want to do that 5 times in a 15 to 18 day period. That is the thermophilic composting window of time that you have concentrated those microorganisms. You're heating that up, you're turning it, you're maintaining that temperature. And then you'll find that after that period of time, as you take temperature, it'll start to go down, because now the food has been eaten, has been decomposed and eaten, and the microorganisms start to go dormant. There's now a concentration of microorganisms in there. They're going to go dormant. It's going to cool down, and then it'll go into the curing process. So before we talked about mesophilic, is the colder temperatures or cooler temperatures going up to thermophilic, and it starts to go down. As it goes down, it's going back into mesophilic stage. And the way to turn your pile is really important. Let me just move mine. Oops. my, hold on. Oh. Turning, well, you can't see what it says right there, but it's turning an aerobic compost pile. So it's really important that you are paying attention, that observation. You will know that if you just put your thermometer in 6 inches, it's much cooler right there on the edges and on the top. It's hard to really get it from the very bottom, but the outer edge is going to be cooler and the center is going to be hotter. So when you turn that pile, you want to take these off in layers. So take the top off, put it in its own pile, and make sure you know that that's the top. And then the sides, sometimes as it starts to heat up, there's actually a little heat layer around that center area. Sometimes you can see that it has separated away from that hotter area. So then you take the sides away, and now that hot part, you take that and that becomes the bottom and sides of the new compost pile. That bottom goes on the top goes into the middle. So this is, it explains it. So that the purpose of this is to decompose that pile evenly. If you kept having that middle part be in the middle, it's going to keep getting hotter and hotter. It's going to go anaerobic. So you have to cool that down, and that's one way. You're diluting it, you're putting and spreading it around. Now, some people just break their pile apart and then just return the whole thing. Just keep in mind this is one way, but the whole point is that you want to make sure that that center that's hot is spread out, and you can do that a number of ways, but this gives you a little visual of it and why to do it. So here's the thermophilic temperature log. So once your compost is built and you've then set up your compost cage or your bin, and you're going to refill by mixing those ingredients. Now you're going to wait for the 24 to 48 hours and check it to see that it's getting these temperatures. Once you hit that 131 to 155 temperature, that's day 1. Once you have that day 1, here's the 3 temperatures, which is the 430 divided by 3. That 143 is the number that you put in your day 1 log, and on and on. So day 2, the same thing. Day 3. On day 4, you're going to test that pile again. You don't log it, but you turn it. And then again, keeping that temperature, 1, 2, and 3 daily log of the average. And on the 4th day, turn it. And then again, 3 days and turn it. So you want to turn it 5 times in a 15 to 18 day period. If it doesn't heat up, you have to turn it and add greens. If it gets over 160, you have to turn it and add carbon and water. You have to dilute that, cool it down. So one measurement can be higher than 160. As you can see up here, I have a 164, as long as the average of all 3 is 160 or less. So just paying attention is like, just because one reading might be 164, you might be at 164, 158, all of them writing close in there. You just want to make sure that the average is lower. So take that, keep that in mind too. And then again, keeping a log of all your ingredients by weight. These are the stages we talked about. The mesophilic temperatures are below 130 at the beginning process and at the end, which is the curing process. Thermophilic temperature range from 131 to 160. That's the active stage, active phase. Once it heats up to 131 and lasts through that 15 to 18 days, when the pile will then cool down because the food source is consumed and microorganisms reproduction has slowed or isn't happening at all even. And now you come into, again, that mesophilic stage and the maturation. That means it's going to cure. So what if it doesn't heat up? Not enough heat means not enough nitrogen and possibly water. So if it's really dry and it's a lot of browns, it might not be heating up. So you add layers of nitrogen and water, and you monitor it to make sure that it is heating up. And so you might have to repeat this a couple of times. And that's the part of, the art of learning it is is understanding that you have to have those percentages in there for it to heat up, right? So you want to log this too, because you know what I mean, this is your learning tool. It doesn't heat up. You want to understand why. What were your materials there? What if you're hot? If it's too hot, goes over 160. You know, this is your danger zone. So if you get over there and you do your temperature in the morning, it's 167, 160. You want to turn your pile right then. So doing a compost pile is also something you have to have time for. You can't say, well, I'll do that when I get home from work. You could have a completely anaerobic pile. And if you're in the middle stage and you've been doing this for 8 days already, you could end with all that work for nothing. So if it's too hot, it's very, very important. Now, if it's too cold, you could wait some time because it's going to get cold and cooler. It's not going to continue to heat. It's not going to heat up because it doesn't have enough materials to heat up. So that is a point that you could take your time, but not when it's too hot. So, and you have to turn that. You have to add carbon, add water, because that, of course, that anaerobic bacteria will just keep multiplying, and they're going to heat and heat and heat. All right. So if you have done this where you've cooled it down, you want to monitor that to make sure you actually have cooled it down. So you go in and you take, once or twice, maybe even 3 times in that first day to make sure that you've gotten that pile down. Okay. And if not, you're going to repeat those steps. You're going to turn that pile again, adding more carbon, more water, just not so much water that's going to be running and soaking, right? So pay attention to that more water isn't what's cooling it down. You're just wetting those materials, those new materials that you're putting in. The carbons, you want to make sure they're very wet in there. So make sure that the hot compost doesn't get too hot. And then there's the curing stage. The thermophilic compost no longer heats up when it's turned. It's ready to be cured or matured. And this can take 3 to 4 weeks for that maturation time. Some people let it, some people do this by seasons. We used to do it by season. I would do a compost at the beginning of the winter, and I'd I'd do the compost and then I'd let it cure through the winter, and then I use it in the spring. So because I'm not doing a lot with Moringa during those winter months, except for it's growing with some nitrogen intercropping, and so through the winter, like peas, right? So beans, like Christmas beans, go year round. Actually, for me, I have them planted at the base of the Moringa trees. And so during the winter, that's a good time for letting that curing process happen. And sometimes it can go faster. And we'll talk about how to check it. So you see these temperatures where that active phase, that thermophilic phase, and then the curing phase is when it starts to level out, and it will stay at that temperature. It'll hit a certain temperature and then it will not go even any cooler than that. So how to know if your compost is ready? Looking at it is one way. You can see it, but it doesn't always answer the whole question. It could look like that, but not really be ready. It could maybe not have cured long enough. So this is what it should look like. The color of 70% dark chocolate. It should have that dark, rich color. It should be fluffy, have good crumb structure. But it should not be so overly dry. You want to be able to still grab some and that clumps together. It squeezes with a little bit of water, but just slightly. And it has a sweet and earthy smell. Compost smell, it's soil, right? All those things are composted together, and things have been killed out. It's just a really clean smell, clean product we have there. And this is one way. Smell is just really important. And this is a simple test. You can just take, any plastic bag that you can close up really well. And you put some in there and you let it stay at the room temperature for 3 days. So if there's anything that's still active, it'll start to have a smell, because also now no air. So there's it's anaerobic in there. No air, which is what anaerobic, like not no air, but very little air. And it's got something that's not decomposed in there, and you'll smell it. And if you do, that means it's not finished. Now, it could be that it's not going to heat up. There's not enough in there that for it to heat up again, right? It's cooled down, it's stayed cooled down, and then you do this simple test, and then you'll know, okay, it's good. It doesn't have a smell, it's curing, and everything that needs to decompose has decomposed. So you can do small piles like this, like we did, cubic yard, or you can do big piles. There's a lot of demand, a lot of interest in compost these days. It's really important, especially the thermophilic, and this could, the hot compost, because it's got to be monitored. The thermophilic can be done larger. You just have a lot of monitoring to do. And, the turning of it is much harder to do in the large scale, by hand. So use some machinery. Here you can see, big rows. People are really getting into this, and companies. And of course, these are, this is monitored and regulated so that, people are following these exact steps, and it's labeled by, your label has to have, everything is regulated, and you're getting that signed off, and you have to go through that process in the United States every year to be recertified for your compost. But you don't want your compost to ever have some problems, because that means that your customer is going to have problems with it. They're going to, their food could die. It could be, it could still have too much nitrogen in it, and they put it on something and it, kills it. So, you have direct feedback from a customer if you're not doing the right thing, if you're not following it closely. But you can see you can do large amounts. Now, this was unlikely that it's thermophilic. It's just, it's thermophilic, but it's not the biological. It's just a hot compost. And here, City of Oakland, I saw this, thought this is great. So municipalities are getting the hang of it. They are understanding that cities have to take responsibility for the waste stream, and they are. In your advanced references, there's also one where the U.S. Composting Council has partnered with the National Restaurant Association. And so restaurants, big amount of waste in the food chain there. And so, all of these activities are really needing to amp up, increase, so that we deal with that waste stream. And the best is that you deal with it right in your own home, where you are you can look in, and there's websites called Zero Waste, where you can reduce your own waste stream by using jars. There's a book I read, it's called Zero Waste, and this woman has certain jars, and she gets bulk everything at the grocery store, and they let her tear. It's called to tear the weight. That means they take away the weight of the jar, and then you're just getting the weight of the contents. So she doesn't have any plastic bags that she's getting anything in, vegetables too. She just everything without that. And she has gone through, her whole house. And in a period of time, when she had two young boys when she was writing this book, now it's a whole movement. But in a year, they had just like this much waste for their whole year. So it is possible to do. You just really have to be mindful of every little thing that you are using, and reuse, recycle. Now, we have a recycle system in the United States that really isn't recycling. We just separate it out, and then all of those plastic or containers get shipped to someplace else. And so there's a whole thing. You have also in your advanced references using fungi and bacteria to break down plastics. And so these are the kinds of things that we have to get on top of, because the amount of waste that's happening across, especially the developed countries, are just notorious. The United States, the worst of all. Just so much waste. And so when cities take it on like this, and now you have all that compost. I lived in a little town a few years ago where they would come to your house and pick up the compost and take it to this, their compost facility. And it was on a certain day, and you had a certain bucket, and they would just take all of that and they would compost it. And so, we know that this has to happen. And then you could go to that place when you were signed up in this program, and you could go and get compost there. So it's a really good win-win situation, and something that we really do all need to get happening everywhere we are, especially in our own use, in our own waste stream. It's another very big composting, and there's a lot. So having this information, I highly recommend and ask that you teach, learn it, teach it, spread the word, have classes, have your neighborhood community compost club. It's actually very fun to do, and involve children. Children are our future composters. If they are brought up with reducing the waste stream, they're not just, have some candy wrapper and you just throw it. And, the mindfulness needs to happen at a really early age. And they get it, they understand it. So training our children, because we weren't trained, but we need to see the consequence of that. We are seeing it, the consequence of our parents not teaching us. So really, my mother's from Japan, so I was raised with a lot of very, very kind of stringent, I would say. She would turn envelopes back, inside out, and use rice, make glue out of rice, and reuse that envelope. There were so many envelopes were coming with a bill or something, and you have this free envelope in there. And so she was reusing everything. In the morning, she wouldn't go and, wash her car somewhere or a hose later. She would go early in the morning when the dew was still on the car and wash the car with the dew. We always had a bucket of water under the shower, and we caught that water and used that water. We have a tub in our sink, and we wash our dishes there. We take that water and we water outside with it every day, 2 or 3 times a day. Sometimes we are using that water a second time. So all these different measures, they add up, in small things, just like having your own cloth bags. We had one of my sisters decided, let's not have all these packaging and paper and everything at Christmas. So they, 4 of us who can sew, 4 of the sisters, start sewing bags, all this, colorful, really beautiful fabrics and ties and stuff. And we put the gifts in there. And that was all reusable, and everybody had, took back the ones, or they all got traded. And we always knew, oh yes, this is a sister who always uses these fabrics, right? So it's a wonderful thing. So think of all these creative ways that we can compost. Compost. We have to. We really have to move into this.